Dylan, thank you so much for joining us today. You've been described as the future face of climate leadership in Australia. Can you tell us a little bit about how your journey has gone so far? And I believe it had something to do with you starting a radio program back in primary school.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Apologies for the late. I thought I was on at 11:30, but things move quickly online. So apologies for the little bit of a shuffle around. I'm calling in from the lands of the Whadjuk people, the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and not only acknowledge their connection to country, but their sovereignty over this land here this morning. It's an interesting question. I wouldn't describe myself as the face of climate leadership in Australia, but it's true that I have been described as that, and that came after I was on Q&A and spoke about the opportunities that we have as a country to be a climate leader, because we used to be. I mean, we had world leading climate change policy in this country for a very brief period of time. And we were, one of the biggest countries in the world to be actively reducing our climate emissions. I think we lose a lot of focus on that sometimes, that we were kind of there. But yeah, my journey to sort of being interested and involved with environmental issues really is tied up with, as you sort of touched on there, is tied up with my journey that I had into media and into radio broadcasting. So I grew up in the Kimberley in northern WA, small town called Fitzroy Crossing. Not a lot to do in Fitzroy Crossing. It is a very small town in the middle of the Kimberley. So it's a long way to anywhere, 4 hours to get to the airport. So it's a pretty remote part of the world. But in Fitzroy, there was a radio station, Wongi Radio, and that's where I was, I guess, I mean, to put it all out there, I mean, I was watching Bob the Builder when I was probably 7 or 8. And they built a radio station, and I was interested in that. It caught me for some reason. I still don't really quite know why. So I started sort of pretending to do radio stuff in the backyard, and my family took me up to the radio station, the local community station. And I sort of got involved from there, to be completely honest. I started presenting a radio program aimed at because Fitzroy was sort of the central school, and there was a lot of like surrounding remote communities that would bring students into schools. So I'd do a radio program in the afternoon playing music for the bus ride home. And that's sort of how I started. And sort of in that, you would take time out and you'd listen to the news that would come over the radio at the top of the hour. And that's kind of what got me interested in politics and policy. And it's an interesting time for the Kimberley, because sort of as I was starting to mature and sort of have a few ideas and an understanding of how the world was working, there was a lot of sort of discussion happening in the Kimberley in relation to environmental issues. So at the time, we had a proposal to construct a coal mine in the catchment area of the Fitzroy River, the Muttawarra, in the local Nyikina language. And it was an interesting discussion. There was a lot to sort of go through there, and I found myself really interested in this coal mining project. Its environmental impact, its climate impact, how it would right down to how it would potentially sort of affect the roads, because we don't have a rail network in the Kimberley. This would be hundreds of trucks going up the road every day. How would that affect, how would this coal mine affect my community essentially, and the climate around me? So I started asking questions about that. I was able to get the scientists from the resource company onto my radio program. This was me when I was about 12, and asking them questions about, why aren't you building, solar farms? Why do you want to put this here? What's happening? I think they're still up on SoundCloud. You can go and listen back to my interview with the guy from Ray Resources. It's an interesting one. And that's what got me interested into the environment. I was then starting to do interviews around gas fracking, which is still something that's happening in the Kimberley. The WA Labor government, when they were first elected, put a moratorium on it. I was doing stories around the moratorium, the scientific inquiry that followed after that on the local radio program. That's now been allowed to proceed in the Kimberley, but not in the Southwest. Why has that happened? Which is a question that we were asking at the time, talking to our local MPs about those issues. So I really come at it from the perspective of it being a question of how our environment interacts with our communities. And from a place like the Kimberley, where the natural environment is such an important part of who we are as people that live in the Kimberley, the First Nations people that call that place home and have for thousands of years, and really being able to capture and talk about that. So that's why I first got interested in talking about these environmental issues. And they sort of all tie back into climate change. So that's kind of the perspective I came at it with.
Oh, wow, okay, so that's a fantastic journey into it so far. And I guess we'll move on to some of the more recent stuff that you've been doing. Also, I forgot to say at the beginning, if anybody has questions for Dylan that they want to pop into the chat that we can come to at the end, feel free to pop them in there. So you recently moderated a session with young people at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas on the topic of stolen inheritance, which is certainly appropriate when we talk about the future impact of climate change. How do you feel young people are approaching the issue of climate change, and what is it that keeps you going?
I think there's a few different ways that young people are engaging with the issue of climate change. And I think they, young people are it's an extremely diverse group of people. I mean, you're talking about an age bracket as opposed to a group of people that are sort of tied together by a political ideology, by any sort of other ways that we tie together groups of people. It's the same way that we, can often tie together, I think young people can often tie together boomers and can often tie together older people and seniors sort of into these categories as if they are sort of homogenous groups. So I think probably number one is to throw that out of the door. But there is, I think, within the community of young people, I think we are beginning to see a general movement, an acknowledgement that young people are coming to terms with the fact that climate change is happening. I think that we're at the point in time now where it isn't up for debate. And it's been that way for a long time. Like it hasn't been up to debate if you've been reading the science, but in our media and in our sort of public discourse, it has still been up to debate. And there's been people that are respectable, seen as respectable, that have said, well, no, maybe we shouldn't be doing action on this. So it's got to that point now, and that's why we're seeing the conversation happening even in, even in our federal politics at the moment, which is a very sort of big area that, climate policy sort of goes there to die. But we are starting to see there be, well, the people that are saying climate change isn't happening are being relegated in large part to the backbench. They aren't, they're vocal, but they're being vocal to an increasingly smaller section of society. And we've even got now sort of the general consensus is that Scott Morrison will say that Australia will aim towards net zero emissions by 2050. It's probably not enough, and it's probably too late. But we've seen that progression happen, and young people, I think, have been at the forefront of that in a lot of ways. And we've sort of come of age in an area where we, as young people, are seeing the impacts that we're having, and we're looking into the future. Like, if lifespans are something to go by, like we've got decades and decades on this planet. What's the world going to look like in 70 years' time, when it's highly likely that most young people today are still going to be alive? What's the world going to look like? It's a very scary thought. So I think there's a group of young people that are very scared, and there's a group of young people that, within that group of young, I think that's a large group of young people that are very scared. There's probably a lot of distrust, disunity. There's people that want to see action. There's the people that you see protesting during the climate strikes that are joining groups like Extinction Rebellion. I think it's a hard question to sort of answer, because we are such a diverse group of people. I think probably the biggest thing that frightens me is a sense of hopelessness. And I think that that's probably the biggest enemy that we have at the moment towards climate action, is possibly not even sort of the people that are holding things back, the lobbyists and politicians that are making these policies. They're an obstruction to climate justice, but a sense of hopelessness from young people and from older people as well, that maybe we just can't change their minds, maybe we just can't do things. I think that's probably the biggest enemy that we need to get over, because if we have that sense of hopelessness, then nothing will happen. We need to mobilize and move around it. So yeah, I'm quite concerned about a growing number of young people and across sort of generations that are growing hopeless at the idea that, hey, maybe we actually can't change this. Maybe we've got to put up with whatever the implications will be on our future, whether that's, the increasing global temperature, everything that comes with that, the natural disasters, the increased droughts, the food shortages. These are issues that we're looking at within our lifetimes, and it is very easy to become hopeless with that.
Okay, yeah, that's leading well into our next question, which is quite a hard one. But do you have any ideas about how we can get young people engaged to demand change from their politicians? Or are too many of them already a bit cynical about it? Because we're one of the few developed economies in the world with no net zero by 2050 target. So how do we best kind of connect and spur more youth into action?
Yeah, it's a very hard question, because I think that, for a bit of context, like I was the Northern Australia liaison for the youth representative to the United Nations, and that involved in June of this year, we travelled around the Northern Territory and Northern WA. I went to, I think it was 12 cities and towns, consulted with over 500 young people in over 50 different consultations. And we're talking about really remote parts of the world, like Nhulunbuy to Darwin, down to Katherine, Fitzroy Crossing, my hometown, Broome, Derby, Kununurra, Wyndham. These are groups of young people that are very much traditionally disengaged from politics, from parts of the world that are traditionally disengaged from politics. The Kimberley has some of the lowest voter registration in the country. The Northern Territory has appalling rates of voter registration, particularly in First Nations communities. That's something that they put a lot of attention to at the last council elections, but it's a hard deal to follow. Like, if people aren't already engaged in politics, how do you get them interested and engaged in politics? I think for all of us here today, like we're all people that are interested in policy and how that affects the future. I think we can all probably trace that back to a point in time, unless you were brought up in a highly political household, which is something that I wasn't brought up in a highly political household. You probably pinpoint to a point in time where we sort of started to engage a bit more critically in our politics, and where we sit in the world and how the world works. So I think probably the biggest thing we need to do is provide more opportunities to young people. And just like generally, I mean, everything I say that's advice to young people can probably work across all different age brackets. We need to be providing these opportunities where young people can say, actually, no, I can have a position here to make that change or to get involved and to start thinking more critically about the world around us. And I think probably the best way to do that is we taking away from this conference and back to our own organisations, the Citizens Climate Lobby, for example, how they could be doing better in this area. But every organisation that you get involved with is actively working to get young people involved. But that's the biggest problem, is we can get young people involved, and we saw this in the youth representative program. I won't name the local council, but there was young people involved in this thing. We sat in on the meeting, and all we heard was the young people raising an idea being shut down by other people. Young person raising an idea being shut down. We've tried this before. No, this isn't our realm of area. And we sort of spoke to them afterward. We had a brief moment where sort of the older people stepped out of the room, and I was sort of like, do you guys feel like you're being heard? And they flat blankly said no, they didn't feel like they were being heard. So probably the biggest thing that we have is we want to get young people involved, but we don't want to listen to them and take their opinions on board. And I think putting those two together, creating systems, and, you know, as organizations, we have, you know, the realm and the tools provided to us in the governance structures that we have to establish spaces where young people can get involved in our organisation, that can be heard, whether that's a committee that's established in the constitution or the bylaws, to actually sort of ingrain them into the decision making of an organisation. There's a lot of little things that can be done along the way, and there's, you know, it's hard to sort of put them up, but I think it's making, not only making the space, but making it so that space can genuinely implement change within an organisation, so that people feel respected and heard, and probably not so much of the, I think we can hear that, you know, well, we're going to hand this over to young people in the future. They need to sit and listen and learn, but two-way learning, in the sense of, you know, young people have really important skills to bring to the table, just as older people do in our society. I don't like the divide that can be put up together. So if you're able to create an organisation or a movement that has young people involved in the conversation as respected members of that organisation, just as much as every other member of that organisation, I think that you're creating a healthy place for change to be made, and that's going to encourage more young people to join. And I think, you know, I mean, we need young people for the future just as much as young people need people that have a wealth of experience to learn from. So there shouldn't be a barrier between the two, and creating ways to break down that barrier, I think, is important.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I think collaboration is totally key when it comes to this kind of crisis that we're in. We do have time, probably about 10-15 minutes, for some questions now, if that's okay. So we've had some in the chat. Errol asked if you've got any ideas about how to make kids feel better about what they can do in regards to climate change. I think there was quite a few questions in the chat about mental health and how young people are being affected by climate change. Do you have any kind of, I guess, maybe like self-care or eco-anxiety kind of tips of how to have conversations with people, but also how young people can kind of stay healthy without getting overwhelmed about the issue?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think it's very easy to say, "Oh, just don't read the news." It's hard. I mean, I can't stay away from the news, and I think that's probably the same for a lot of people. I think we've got to probably highlight the fact that we do need to take care of ourselves. But taking care of ourselves doesn't necessarily mean not taking care of the environment. But there's a lot of groups and organisations that work on very tangible and practical on the ground sort of environmental things. And that can even be doing up your backyard and planting a heap of native sort of plants and making it a natural sort of biodiverse area and getting involved with other organizations. That's fantastic for my mental health. It may not work for everyone, but I think that that's something that we need to do as well, is get involved in that practical stuff whilst maintaining the goal of, this isn't going to solve climate change, but it might help a local wetland, which is very important as well. But I think also focusing on the little changes that are happening is quite important. And I think that, I think there is a lot of hope that can be found in the fact that it's very well established now that we are going to make a commitment for net zero by 2050. Like, that's something that this, conservative liberal government has sort of been saying, we're not going to do. And now there's pretty good chance that they're going to do it. There's a lot of nitpicking that can be done. I'm sure that it's not going to be a perfect target in any way, shape or form, but that's movement that's happened. And I think even within the last few years, we've seen people go from, in our federal politics, people going from sort of, we saw Malcolm Turnbull get rolled over climate policy, just as he had been rolled as opposition leader over climate policy earlier. And that's because there was a small minority of politicians in the party room that were holding back that change from happening. And now what we're seeing is actually these more moderate centrist liberals are starting to stand up. And I think that was spurred on in large part by the fact that Tony Abbott was kicked out by Zali Steggall, that are saying, well, actually, no, our electorates are saying that we need climate action. Like Jason Falinski, Dave Sharma, for example, and they're actively pushing that within their message. And that's having just as equal a sway on the direction of our politics in the country. I'm not saying that any of this is perfect, but we're starting to see little things happen, which is starting to set us up in a position that is going to put us into the future. I think a lot of hope could probably be found at the last state election here in WA, where we had the Liberal Party outflanked Labor in a lot of areas of climate policy, which was something that was very surprising to a lot of people, that was pretty well universally welcomed by the environmental lobby organisations. We saw that move get put in, and then we saw the Labor Party come and say, well, the power prices are going to go up. That's what's going to happen. We can't be doing this, can we? But since then, Labor here in WA has moved stronger on some environmental issues. At the last election, they didn't run on anything to do with forestry, but now we're by 2023 going to be banning all forms of forestry in native forests in WA, which is a massive stage to protecting some of these large carbon sinks that we have in Western Australia. So I think things are moving forward. They're not moving forward fast enough, but the pace that they're moving forward in it is speeding up. And focusing a little bit on that is probably what you need to do to remember that these protests that you're doing, these phone calls that you're making to politicians, the meetings you may be having with people, are starting to push for change, and they're very, very slowly starting to overpower the messaging of these big corporations that are fueling climate change. So I think that it's happening. It's not as fast as I think a lot of people would like it, but it's speeding up, and hopefully it'll get to that stage soon. So probably a mix of self-care, but also like remembering that actually you are making difference, and we're all making change, every single one of us here in this meeting tonight, by continuing to have this conversation. And if we all shut up and stopped it, it would completely go the other direction. So we're starting to see that happen. Don't be hopeless, because change is happening and it's speeding up.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, even in just the last couple of years, the way that any kind of climate discussion has progressed has been super amazing to see. So we just got to take the small wins and keep going with it. But we've still got probably another 10 minutes. There's a few more questions about, since you're from a regional town, why do you feel the regions seem more likely to elect non-climate aware politicians, even though they are feeling the effects of climate change?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, to be completely honest. Um, the I don't know. I don't know, to be completely honest. It's a very, I think in a regional seat, you're more likely to have a and this is just more so talking about the real politic of it, like that there is generally less likelihood that you're going to, like most regional seats are fairly safe seats, most of them, like there are a few that are up in the air. It's hard to get to know your politicians. Like I come from a federal electorate of Durack. Like we've got a Liberal member of Parliament, the Minister for Defence Industry, ex-Minister for the Environment, Melissa Price, for that very brief period between Scott Morrison getting the Prime Ministership and the after the cabinet reshuffle after the election. But Durack's a massive seat. Like it is huge. Like I could be in Durack sitting 1,500 kilometers from here in the in Columbaroo, like right at the northern tip of Western Australia. And I could also be in Durack driving 40 minutes north right now from Perth. Like that's how big Durack is. It is massive. Like it is only 2 electorates away from me in terms of only 1 electorate away from me actually in terms of moving away. Like I'm in Cowan at the moment, and Ali's seat. And then you've got Pierce, which is Christian Porter's seat just north of me. And then you've got Durack. And that stretches for thousands of kilometres. Like we don't see our federal MP very often, which is kind of understandable. Like it's a massive area to cover, and you've got, you know, as many people as you do in Wentworth spread out across that much of an area. And that happens, that's, you know, probably the extremity of it. Like Durack's the biggest electorate in Australia, but regional electorates tend to be larger. They tend to only see their MP fairly short, you know, short occasions. And I think that there's a general sense when it comes to federal politics, like I think there's a larger focus in regional areas on state politics. We see changes in seats. When it normally comes to federal elections, typically you'll see people tend to vote for the incumbent or the incumbent party, regardless of their views. You see that a lot happen in New South Wales and eastern states with the Nationals in terms of just voting because there's an idea and an understanding that the Nationals is a party that's going to represent the interests of regional communities, and they do from time to time on a lot of things. They will stand up to the Liberals when it comes to things like regional broadband and all of these really important issues. And it's sort of a weighing up, you know, we need these essential services. But then you've also got, I guess, the situation where they're also going to stand up to some of the moderate Liberals and be like, actually, no, we shouldn't be progressing on climate change. Regional politics is a very interesting area, and it changes from area to area. So like my understanding of it in WA is going to be vastly different to sort of someone else's analysis of a seat in rural New South Wales. But there's a lot to do with that. And I think, you know, you've also got regional seats that have large mining communities as well. And that's typically going to sway towards not, I say mining, fossil fuel industry, because I think we do need to decouple mining from fossil fuels. Because I think that there is a lot of mining that happens. It isn't fossil fuel related. And as long as it's done in a way that is environmentally friendly, there has to be some room for it somewhere in the world for us to be able to build things like wind turbines and solar panels. So yeah, I think there's a big difference there. And a lot of people from East have an idea of WA that we're a very fossil fuel dependent economy. But the bulk of our mining and resources comes from iron ore, which isn't a fossil fuel. It's a resource that's used to make things, which is different to mining something like coal. So WA, like a seat like up in the Pilbara, will have a very different perspective on fossil fuels as a seat happening somewhere in the Hunter Valley. So yeah, I think it's hard to categorize all regional seats together. But I think that those are a few factors relating to it, and the media as well. Like there's a big media desert in regional areas. Like we've got mostly you will have the local ABC, you will have possibly a local community radio station, and then it's typically going to be a newspaper owned by one of the 3 major sort of companies, and that's either Australian Community Media, News Corp, or in WA, the West Australian. So it is hard to get some alternative views going out there as well.
Okay. We have time for probably about 2 more questions, if that's okay with you. We've got one about, basically the climate struggle has been one that's been shared by First Nations people since a long time. Is there anything that's kind of happening in this space, or any projects that are making headway that CCL can support? Like, how can CCL best engage with First Nations people based on your experience?
Well, I'm not a First Nations person, so I'd probably preface this conversation with that. But I think it's in terms of just opening up that line of communication and having a chat, which I think a lot of people can be quite scared to do from time to time, is just starting that conversation. Because I mean, that's really where movements and big change is made, is really just by starting a conversation. So yeah, there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on up in the Kimberley and in a lot of remote areas in terms of carbon farming. When it comes to promoting engagement with Indigenous ranger groups, which is one of the biggest success stories of like federal government policy in Australia, that in the environmental world is the large success of the Indigenous Ranger program. That probably doesn't get enough attention. Engaging with those groups and engaging with some of the real practical areas. I know, especially like here in Australia, we do have a large potential for carbon farming. We've got a large land mass. We can, like, that's a big area that we could start to really, like, it's already happening. There's a lot more potential for that to grow. So it's probably in relation to that and linking in with existing groups, not necessarily going in and starting new organisations. It's really got to be something based on partnerships.
Sweet, okay. And I guess last question that we have time for. So how important do you think it is for the government to set a net zero emissions target and legislate an effective price on carbon?
Pardon me, sorry, could you just repeat that?
No worries. What's your opinion on the government setting a net zero emissions target and legislating an effective price on carbon?
Legislating an effective price on carbon. It is a very interesting question. It's become so toxic, like the idea of a carbon price in Australia. Like the party that pushed for it, that got it pushed through, seems to want to forget it ever happened. Like if you listen to federal Labor people or Labor people in general, it comes down to, oh, we missed our chance to have climate action when the Greens voted down Kevin Rudd's policy previous to Julia Gillard being elected. But what that does is it negates the idea that actually, once Julia Gillard was elected, there was a successful climate policy implemented in Australia. Oh my God, hit my and that's what happened. I think we forget sometimes that Australia already had a carbon pricing scheme in place, and there were mistakes made around its promotion in calling it a carbon tax, because there was commitments made that we'll never implement a carbon tax, and then they were able to change it. I mean, Peter Credlin admitted it. They changed an emissions trading scheme into a carbon tax. They basically lied to the Australian people about it, and the Australian people responded, which is it's hard to hear about. There was that great Four Corners sort of documentary, I think it was last year, going over that period in our history, and it's a difficult watch. Because we were sort of leading the world when it came to climate policy many years ago. Like this is over a decade now. Like this is a long time ago in politics. But because of what happened there, a carbon tax has become a politically toxic term, even though I think that it's probably the most effective way that we can implement emissions reduction in Australia. I don't know how you get over that. You've probably got to convince the Labor Party to get over that a little bit, and probably support and endorse how Julia Gillard's policies were actually like making Australia one of the world leaders in climate policy, and that was what they did. And now they're sort of arguing over whether they're going to allow more coal mines, and you've got sort of Labor's got their own splinters in terms of where policy sits. It's a hard question to have. I think it's something we need to head towards. Net zero by 2050 is, I think there's more and more evidence coming out now that's probably too little too late, or probably just about the right amount, but way too late. We need to start looking at how we, it's a hard question to have. Like, we've fought for so long to get to that stage, and we're having a government now that's on the brink of committing to that, on the brink of having a net zero by 2050, and now we've got to figure out a way that we're going to say, well, actually, that was just a start. Now we need to change. Now we need to be more ambitious. It's a difficult question to have. But again, I think it comes back to my earlier point, which was that we're starting to change is starting to speed up, and we're starting to gain momentum. And I think we will reach a critical mass fairly soon, within the next few years, where it's going to be a lot easier to do this sort of stuff. But the electorate needs to speak up. Like there needs to be, and I agree with what Tanya put in the message there, is, the electorate does need to speak up and make those phone calls. And that's going to make it a lot easier for the politicians when they get behind those closed doors in the party room meetings that are like, well, my seat's on the line if I don't act on this. So we need to both be lobbying politicians, but also be promoting the fact in this electorate that actually, if this doesn't happen, we're going to have to vote for someone else. So it's a tricky political calculation. I'm not a political scientist. That's just the way that I see things at the moment. I think we're starting to see change happen, but there's many steps to get where we need to go, and we need to be putting the processes in place that once we get to that stage, this is where we're moving forward. So net zero by 2050 is definitely something to aim towards in terms of policy, but really we need to be pushing for something a lot sooner, a lot quicker. And once we get that win for net zero by 2050, what are we going to do next? That's probably decisions that organisations like this one will have to make, and other environmental organisations around the country. But yeah, I think we've matured a lot as a country and as an electorate, I think, in these conversations, and we need to be able to, I guess, use that maturity to a degree. So fingers crossed we can get there. I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I think you've just given us all a lot of hope. So we're going to have to wrap that one up if that's okay. But thank you so much for coming by today, Dylan. And I think everybody here is really grateful for the input that you've given us. And I hope you enjoyed getting to meet some of us as well, and look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you very much.